Thanks for being part of the solution in the first conference of Natural Resources and Development. This is a brief summary of the Keynotes presentations.
Key cornerstone for achieving these goals. As stated by the GWP, we need to communicate that this is a finite and vulnerable resource, even though in some places it can be perception there is a plenty. Second, there are multiple stakeholders. The ones that manage water, the ones that receive water for and depend on water for the provision of. There's a need for recognizing the role of women on the preservation, management, and administration of this resource, just as it is for food security and in some places for soil conservation. They said that water has an economic and social value. So there are 3 E's: ecosystem efficiency, social equity, and ecosystem sustainability that has to be looked. A nice paper published this year, Climate Change Adaptation and Integrated Water Resources Management in the Water CNRD. That means that we believe, or our framework tends to believe, that the past is a good representation of what it comes in the future. Like this is a NASA live cartoon. You see Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere, they're not equally enlightened, and perhaps you can see and recognize capitals and very iconic places, changes or trends in many natural resources. They all have, in which is almost an exponential, just in the case of CO2 emissions. It took us a while to double what societies are influencing the environment. And along with CO2, you see, for instance, a cartoon, a picture of temperature anomalies in the Northern Hemisphere. It's known now as global environmental change, going beyond climate change. Resources and assets for humanity that have to be maintained in order to ensure a nice living for humanity. And that means access to food, water, a decent income, education, resilience, and other things that are equally important, although are difficult to. For such uncertainty, this is an example for Fortaleza. And the idea will be how to take advantage of what is the knowledge that we have at hand. And the knowledge we have at hand is, for instance, forecasts of El Niño Southern Oscillations. Now, how to use the forecast of El Niño-like events or Pacific decadal oscillation if we're dealing with interannual and up to decadal sort of modes of variability. What is happening with land use and forestation and deforestation processes is important for the dynamics of water resources. Hey, look at this. The demands of water in this condition for agriculture will increase. We also, an example of this water, food, energy nexus is the intersection of weather and climate events, droughts, floods, heavy rains, the vulnerability of the systems, and the level of exposure. We have this triangle of 3 fundamental determinants of water availability and water demands: ecosystems, climate, and society, arrows that show the relationships between ecosystems and climate, how climate. The intersection between availability and needs defines the space of water security. And this water security is a function of quantity, but also a function of quality of water resources. Give me this opportunity.
My work will be to scare you. So this is my main goal. The mind change of the scientists that work with earthquake have changed their minds. In this area, between Sumatra and Andaman, there were little or medium earthquake, 47. So scientists were expecting that kind of earthquake, that all this area ruptured at once. and it made a huge, massive earthquake and tsunami that cost 250,000 of people. And in Japan, it was the same, just the same story again. And here in red, you can see where they were expecting earthquakes. But it happened really that the earthquake was here. So it wasn't a very problematic area. Even the Japanese, they were expecting earthquakes around 8.4 in magnitude, and it happens that 9 occurred. So it was 10 times bigger. They believe in the concept of typical earthquake. Earthquake is this kind of earthquake, similar size, so every time it is going to happen that size of earthquake. Now it is clear that any subduction zone can produce any kind of earthquake. Where we are now in central Chile, it is expected a typical earthquake. The possibility of having another earthquake is larger. And they are thinking in this model, they are proposing that there are super cycles and super earthquake. In time, if this is time, you have some earthquake little, you have medium, and you have a very big one, giant ones. But they need more time. Then they have different frequencies. History, written history, because in Chile we have 500 years of written history when the first Spaniards arrived. And also using geology, the signatures that are left by these very massive events. We usually go to Sevilla, this is the Archivo de Indias, where the Spaniards decide to put all the documents. Okay, by the geological side, this photo was taken after the 2010, you know, the last big event in Chile, it was 8.8. This photo is from Pirúa, south of Concepcion, 2 kilometers inland, upstream. So the tsunami came here and went upstream. Carefully, you can see that beside the plant, you can find a lot of marine sand. So you can see the original soil and then the plants that were buried by the sand. So, geologically, you can use that information because in Chile we don't have hurricanes. In this photo we can see the 1960 soil. You know that in Chile there was in 1960 the largest earthquake recorded in human history. It happened here, just 1,000 kilometers from here. Inside a pit you can find a soil and some plants. So you can take that plants that were killed by the tsunami and you can date them. And dating them with radiocarbon, for instance, you can get the ages of the events. This is just in the middle of the segment that was ruptured in 1960. Our work was focused on Maullín. This is a very little, nice Chilean town. Sand here from a past tsunami. We have a soil, another tsunami here, a soil, another tsunami, a soil, another tsunami, the current soil waiting for the next tsunami. So it's a kind of record. A big earthquake happened similar to 1960 in this year, and we reconstruct 2,000 years of earthquake history. 1737, 1837, and 1960. So it means every 28 years, a big earthquake happened. We supposed before that. But then we understand that the really big event, like 1960, happened more unusually. They were not very unusual. So they need at least 300 years to recur. So in that way, now we can understand why the 1960 event was so big, because it was accumulating energy from 1575, probably, and not from 1837. And this is very, very close to this new idea of super cycles. It's fitting.
Machu Picchu and the empire of the Inca, which is a very good example for autarky system, but autocratic system. They say that they had an information velocity of 500 kilometers per day, only with couriers running along doing the morning sport. Yeah? Here you can see the silos with a natural ventilation system, the basis of the food security in that empire. So that there was a very stable production in the Neolithics, more or less 10,000 years ago. We have this fear that that food insecurity causes inflation, causes economic problems. Can we feed so many people on our world? They say yes, but it is important that in this case nearly 70% of the increased production, agricultural production, is caused by a higher productivity. That means saving resources. Because especially the small farmers, they suffer from this scarcity of labor. Many governments of many countries subsidize the prices for cereals, for staple foods, to avoid social conflicts in the urbanized centers. The consequences are for the agricultural sector are really very problematic because of the low prices in the eyes of the small farmers, especially of the consequences of this urbanized world. Innovations have to cause at least 70% of the economic growth, and therefore the innovations, they play a very, very important role in the economic growth. And innovations are generated by research. That's a very, very simple equation. Have a lot to do with the small farmer problems. Why? The small farmers are shifted into marginal locations. They cannot accumulate capital. They don't have capital to be accumulated for the future. So they have no concept for the future. They generally tend to overuse their resources, their small resources. The research and development from after the Green Revolution was mainly dedicated to larger farm and for the commercial sector, and not so much for the small farmer sector. Ladies and gentlemen, another graphic shows that 50% of the hungry people are small farmers, and this blue sector represents the urban poors, and the other are fishers, rural workers, and small farmers, only small farmers, 50% suffering from hunger. And the problem of the small farmers is that they cannot make use of the cost regression of the economies of scale because of their small quantities they produce. From Brasilia, here in a flat region, 31 soybean harvesters are preceding 12 tractors go under the zero tillage cultivation techniques, which is very, very common meanwhile in Latin America. Here you have the opposite example in Cambodia, small farmer producing as a riparian seasonal agriculture producers, and they produce with a high risk of floods and so on. Vietnam and that countries, you can see that people are forced to go into the slopes. So meanwhile we have available technology like this, precision farming controlled by satellites. We can minimize the input of fertilizer, of pesticides and so on. This is the future, because it's all related to the knowledge we have available in the universities, in the research institutions, and this must be the future. In the case of irrigation, meanwhile we have technologies available to minimize the water or to optimize the water supply of the plants, or the biotechnology and the possibilities with biotechnology, only to mention some. And we have to create a new green revolution in this sense, focused on the small farmer sector. Thank you for attention and for patience.
And disasters really reshape the ecological environment and the development patterns. So they're hugely disruptive, but they're part of our natural world. Resilience is kind of a buzzword, and it has sort of two definitions. It has an engineering definition that really focuses on the sort of capacity to absorb shock and maintain functions. From, you want the column to sort of move and come back to center, right? But from an ecological side, it really is much more about the capacity for renewal. There's a wonderful quote from Charles Darwin that says, not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. It's a process, and it's a process that involves social, economic, institutional, infrastructure, ecology of the community. It's not something you can easily pin a label on. But the case in Chile in 2010 was a remarkable set of issues. So Chile had very low casualties. They had very good building codes. And the government used a tax basically on the copper industry and other sort of non-affected industries to pay for the reconstructions. And they have essentially completed it in a 4-year time frame. This February is the 4th anniversary, and most of the recovery is complete, including some repairs, some acquisition, some social housing on new land, and some individual homeowners. In fact, but all of it was focused on these individual families on their sites who stayed in their communities, who went back to work, and I think it was enormously successful and an important model. Renovation of existing social housing and improvement of existing social housing, and replacement new as well. Equally important was the sort of ecological side, the planning for the future. They were very flexible to adapt the programs over time. They improved the living standards, they improved construction quality, they used land use for hazard reduction, things that really improved day-to-day life, as well as reduce hazards. I think what a doctors would call acute pain on a chronic condition. Haiti was poor and had development issues before the earthquake, and the earthquake really just devastated the country. There were some 300,000 homes collapsed, more than 1 million homeless. These are mostly informal settlements, and I am sad to say most of them are being rebuilt right where they are. There is some effort, real good efforts to make a difference, but the informal camps had water and sanitation problems. Things like street markets were reestablished very quickly, but the country needed economic development before the earthquake, and they still need economic development in order to sort of bring them into the century. So how do you do recovery planning here? Nobody who owned anything, and many people claimed they owned things. Many people sold pieces of land 5 or 6 times. Hurricane Katrina was one of those where you saw that we actually had very high casualties. National government did a pretty bad job. They insist on temporary housing, and the mayor is demolishing 40,000 houses. In the US, we have very inflexible government programs. Somebody yesterday used the term institutional rigidity, and I really liked it. To be reminded that even in developed countries, we have deep pockets of underdevelopment, and we can't forget that. One of the things the government does do in the US is they spend a huge amount of money on infrastructure. So whether or not they repaired it to the right standard is another question, but it's very poor. Government role strong or limited, how against individual choice. And you see, sort of China had a very strong government role, but very little citizen input. Haiti had very little government role and very little input. Over here in the US, we have kind of a lot of choice, but very little help. I think Chile and New Zealand are kind of in a sweet spot where they have a high amount of both. So I have 7 lessons for successful recovery. One is that housing is essential. You cannot do recovery without dealing with housing. Speed is not the only criteria, and speed is definitely not always your friend, as we've learned from China. We have to, all of them, every place says managing information is important. Lower Manhattan was the most recently redeveloped part of New York City. This is Hurricane Sandy. The blue is the water inundation in Lower Manhattan. Not insignificant, sea level rise and other things. I mean, it's not just going to be the hurricane, it's going to be many other factors. And so kind of building things into the way we build is very important. My second challenge is that we really have to build hazard mitigation into land use. This is I think what we really need is to do what Christchurch has done and very much micro-zone the building requirements. If you're going to build here, you better have a very different set of criteria than if you're going to build back here. Third challenge is that I think we really have to make our resources count. And yet, I look at this land which was once a wetland and which once had trees and streams and now floods every year. And I think we could do a better job of planning, of land use, of recognizing that we have to be more careful with resources and much more human focused with these communities, because I think we could do more with less if we did that. Global disaster losses and limited resources, I think, require a new approach to relief and to aid. Resilience is a process. It's not just a single thing that you do. It's not only within governments, but within international agencies, and stop having one group just work on food and one group just work on shelter and not ever talk to each other. I think we need much more collaboration and cooperation.
Come to Europe. The vast majority of the areas that people would be familiar with, the great cities of Northern Europe, spend much of their time under 3,000 meters of ice back 400,000 years. And the interesting thing about that diagram is to remind you that normality is a frozen, dry world. Ephemerancy. They're like the little sparks that come off a fire, they disappear up the chimney. But the normality of the world is a world we never see. That's the normal world, is land. This is water. And then I asked them, do they know how much of the land is made up of the deserts and the mountains and the wastelands of the world? A third. A third, we're going to chop off 1/3. And how much of the world is made up of jungles and woodlands and forests? Another third. This is all of the pasture lands of the world, all of the croplands of the world, all of the cities and roads and villages of the world. 25% of that are the big pastures. I'm trying to hold in my hand here all that's left. This tiny fragment is all of the active agriculture in the world, and all of the cities in the world, and all of the places that we live in. 1% of that, these are the places we walk in. Normally, I give my students a little cocktail stick or a pin so they can hold it on, because it is so tiny. And this part here, we never use, we never see, we never visit. To understand the true scale of the world, to understand the true scale of the environment in which they are looking more closely. As a planner, we all begin with demography. Demography, we planners say to one another, is destiny. Demography is destiny. So for instance, this diagram here is a diagram of the fertility trajectories of the world. Fertility peaked between 1960 and 1970. And all over the world, mothers whispered in their daughters' ears, there is no need for you, my darling daughter, to have 20 children the way I did, so that 2 might survive. Assumptions of what's taking place with fertility are critical to understanding the likely future population peak of the world increasing. So we're living in a world where 2 remarkable things have happened. The population is growing, not because people have started to breed like rabbits, but because people have stopped dying of flies. But they're living longer and longer, and the life expectancy is converging all across the world. We notice that those curves can be matched to what's taking place in various different countries in the world, which you may be familiar with. The consequences, as you can see for those curves, produce a quite remarkable and seldom discussed fact. With the year 2050 to 2070, we're going to see in that period the beginning of one of the most remarkable inflection points in human history. One of the most important things about planning is that planning serves. Planning does not lead. It makes provision for the future. We may not feel comfortable with that future, but we must serve it by understanding and making preparation for it. Planners do not make the babies who will live in the houses in the future. They do not make the jobs that will be in the factories in the future. They do not make the services that will occupy the office buildings of the future. They do none of those things. A planner never made a job in her entire life. Think about it. It sounds like such a long way off in the future. These kids here, who are being born next year, they'll all be 36 that year. And they're going to be more different from us than you can imagine. On the value systems of people all over the world. So on the left-hand axis is the extent to which people's decisions are based on rational values or scientific values. On the top, or on the bottom part of the left-hand one, is the extent to which people make decisions based on traditional systems, religious systems, tribal systems, the way it's always been done around here systems. On the left-hand side of the graph, people ask themselves a question in the evening, will we have any food for our children tomorrow? On the right-hand side, people say, where would we go for dinner tonight, darling? So we can describe human achievement, human ambition, as being a journey from the bottom left-hand side of the screen toward the top right. I cannot tell you what the values of the children in Chile who are born next year will be in 2050, nor in Ireland. But what I can tell you is they will move in this direction. And the further a country has to move, the more profoundly and the more rapidly their values will change. The future is brought about not by changes in technology, not by somebody in a silver suit flying in their car and arriving in to a dinner that will materialise on the table from a teleporter, caused by changes between people's ears. In 1960, the whole world changed and went in a different direction. Well, I think they reached that inflection point where getting more and more of things doesn't become enough, and after a certain stage, after that inflection point, people want to examine things that influence their lifestyle. After people finish that phase of material increase, they begin to have a completely different set of priorities. And the priorities are reflected in the things they spend their money on. You eventually start to become obsessed with personal development, education, knowledge, and finally, self-expression. There will be new realities, making new demands. And it will be their world we're planning for, not for any of us. Not for any of us. To being more populous, will be older and will live older all over the world. And the population themselves will be wealthier, healthier, and wiser. Wiser is a word for education. These are the drivers. These are the choices that people will make. These are the choices that people will spend their money on what they will do with their income all over the world. The demand. So the more we use, the more we have. They are paying farmers year after year after year to take land out of agriculture because we produce too much food and we make too much distortion on the agricultural markets of the rest of the world. Malthus was wrong. With fewer people, not few, excuse the typography, who will be better educated, healthier and wealthier, they will have better governance. There will be better management of resources and better efficiency live in urban areas. Urban value systems on rural areas. And you may have very different duties from those that you imagine. Because the happiness of these children at the bottom, and particularly the happiness of those who are nearest and dearest to you, will depend on the competitiveness and quality of the cities in and near which they work. The successful cities will create urban hinterlands that will be valued and managed and sustainable, which will produce the best urban outcomes, the best environmental outcomes. I'm inviting you to look at this checklist. I'm inviting you And yet it's threatening you to ask whether these are the types of words that appear in your own lists when you're evaluating the work you're doing. Because certainly they expose you to ridicule, certainly expose you to people saying you're naive, but you know what? In the long run in history, the people who are optimistic were the people who were should be done. The biggest problem I see is an increasing alienation of the scientific community from the political community because of the extent to which the scientific community, and I've heard it a number of times in these two rooms in the last 2 days, are proposing that they become involved in advocacies. You have to remind yourself continually that you are involved in planning, that you have a particular place in planning, and the people that you're planning for are not and never will be yourselves. They are these people here whom you and nobody has ever met and whose needs we can only dream about. Thank you.
From the point of view of energy security, large hydro is a very strategic asset for countries, especially for oil and gas dependent countries. In the hydro ICEN discussion, one of the major objections to the project has been the need to take electricity from Patagonia to central Chile, which means thousands and thousands of transmission lines. That problem would not be there if we had in the region the characteristic which I have as a failure of regional integration. The ideal situation would have been to the power generated in Hydro ICEN to be evacuated to the Argentinian grid, which is already in place, and extracted from the Argentinian grid in central Chile. Energy infrastructure integration occurs day to day in Europe, for example. In Europe, Denmark has an extremely large share of wind energy, very deeply interconnected with European grid. So basically, one of the obstacles in Latin America for increased share of very large renewable generation is the failure of regional integration. We realize that some of the trends that we are seeing in real life do not depend on the actual resources endowment or resource base, but depend on actual policy failure. It's also very prominent also in the oil and gas sector. Basically, most of the countries in the region in the last 10 years or since the early 2000s to now have an increasing share of policies to promote non-conventional map. This map is from the basically the Observatory of Environmental Conflicts challenge for countries of the region, which is developing the capacity to actually compensate local communities in a more expedite way rather than in ad hoc negotiations, which impede project development and at the same time fail to give adequate compensation to the communities. And this is basically the taxes captured by government. So just to summarize some of the political issues in the mining sector, with the price boom, basically many countries are looking again at their tax regimes and how progressive is the tax regime, and if it is prepared to capture the rents when you have these upswings in price. Minerals that some of the major mining exporters like Peru and Chile went through the last 10 years with a more progressive taxation would have been capable of capturing a substantially larger amount of rent for the public sector. Recently, there has been a linkage between mining rents and, for example, the new needs for education resources. The Hardwick rule, which basically says that in the case of non-renewable resources, economic theory basically tells you that what you should do is tax away these rents, which means a more progressive taxation regime, and save them to invest them in other forms of capital. That means human capital, which is education, public education, technological innovation, whatever. In the terms of Latin America, because we have such important deficits in public education, I think an application of the Hardwick rule would generally link this type of rents to education, and that will be in the political agenda. It's very controversial, but it will be in the political agenda of the mining countries in the future.
A brief summary of the keynotes presentations. Thanks for being part of the solution in the first conference of Natural Resources and Development.